From our studios in the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans, welcome to our Louisiana Eats podcast series, Quick Bites. I'm Poppy Tooker. New Orleans chef Alon Shaya has been very busy lately. Since parting ways with the Besh restaurant group in September 2017, the James Beard Award-winning chef has formed his own hospitality company, released a new cookbook memoir, and is now opening 2 modern Israeli restaurants. Saba will open in New Orleans this spring, and Safta is expected to open in Denver by June. It hasn't always been an easy journey for Alon, but the star chef has no interest in erasing the past. Within the pages of Shaya, an Odyssey of food, my journey back to Israel, Alon shares autobiographical tales, beginning with stories of a troubled childhood as a young Israeli immigrant in Philadelphia. He traces his path from undisciplined youth to rebellious chef to culinary celebrity. On today's podcast, Alon gives us a candid look at his life through the meals and memories that shaped the man he is today, plus a glimpse of what's next on the horizon. Alon, welcome back to Louisiana Eats. You have always been one of my favorite people to talk with on the radio or off, so welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Poppy.
Congratulations about your book. It is absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
And I love beautiful cookbooks, but what I really, really love and was so impressed by in your book is the depth of your personal story that you really share with us. Many people don't write memoirs this revealing until much later in life. What was your motivation?
Well, I knew I wanted to write a cookbook and to kind of compile recipes that really meant a lot to me. And when I began thinking about how I was going to write the cookbook, I didn't quite know how I was going to be able to get all of my story into recipes that would make sense for a cookbook, like hummus and gnocchi and jambalaya and a turkey sandwich that reminded me of my father, and all of these things that I felt that were special to me. I didn't know how to put into a book in a way that it would really flow. And so I just kind of started writing from the beginning. And I started writing about my earliest memories of food and my earliest memories of my family. And I got a chance to, interview my father and my mother and ask them questions that I'd never asked them before. And, the book just really kind of organically grew into this personal memoir and a series of short stories. And the really great thing was that the recipes all kind of blossomed from the stories.
I'd like to start with some of your earliest, most formative memories when it comes to your life as a chef today. I am particularly touched that to you, the scent of roasting eggplants and peppers is a safe smell of home that you relate to your Bulgarian grandparents.
Yeah. I was in first grade, and, we were new immigrants to America. And, I was having a very tough childhood and struggling with a lot of family issues. My mom and my dad had separated just a year after, my sister and my mother and I moved to Philadelphia.
And you were kind of the last to know. I found it particularly poignant that you didn't realize what was happening until Dad didn't get in the car and y'all drove away.
Yeah, and, I was 5 years old. And so at the age of 5, it's like, what do you really analyze in those types of situations? And so everything at that point in my life was this kind of a lot of really negative surprises in my life. And I remember coming home and opening the front door to my house, and that smell of peppers and eggplants being charred over an open flame just permeated the house, and it hit me once I opened the door. And it wasn't that I, at that moment, knew that my grandmother was making lunch. It was that I knew that she was there. and from that smell.
Because she
And
was there all the way from Israel. I mean, this
yeah,
wasn't grandma who was around the block.
right. Her and my grandfather had come to visit from Israel, and I didn't even know they were coming. I just opened the door and smelled that, and I knew that they were there. At that moment, and I remember that moment very vividly, even from such a young age, I felt comfortable. I felt like everything was kind of normal again. And it was a smell that reminded me of when I didn't have to, change my accent, or when I didn't have to try to make new friends that weren't really accepting me because I was this, weird little Israeli kid, in Philadelphia.
Change your accent. You almost changed your name because
Yeah.
Alon, which
Yeah.
was how your mom pronounced it,
Yeah.
was just a little too foreign for
Yeah.
American mouths.
Right. And so every moment of my life, from, what I would wear to how I would talk to, what I would pick up in conversations from my teachers or my the people that I went to school with, like everything was a little bit of a challenge. And we were very poor, and so it was, doubly hard because my mom was working two jobs, and I was very, even at that time in first grade, I was doing all the grocery shopping for the house, and so I really had to figure out where my place was, and I never really did that. It was always hard to figure that out. But when I smelled that food cooking, when I smelled those vegetables charring, that to me was like this universal feeling. It felt normal. It felt safe. It felt like things were kind of back to normal, even just for a little bit. And I never forgot that. And I still think about her every time I roast peppers and eggplants. Like that memory comes right back to me, and my grandmother comes right back into my thoughts. And I've always cherished those moments.
That is the power of food, isn't it?
Yes.
I believe that in your life, food becomes a redemption for you. And I, previous to reading this book,
Right.
had this idea about this sweet, sweet little Israeli boy who's doing his best to help take care of mom and the household.
Right.
And I learned that, in fact, that wasn't really who you were, particularly as time went on. I was a bad teenager too, Alon, but how bad were you? I mean, what were the kind of things you were up to?
Well, I really surrounded myself with people that were harmful to me. And, we would get into fights. We would pick fights with people. I would skip school. I would vandalize the school. I would, you know, um, sell drugs and use drugs. And
You're a really big guy. So
yeah,
I've never looked at you as an imposing sort of person, but I guess if you've got an angry, violent streak in you, you would be somebody you'd steer
well,
clear of.
I did have that. And what food taught me was that I could overcome those things. And I think that the reason that the book is called My Journey Back to Israel is because I've had to take this journey, and that journey is all about falling and getting back up. It's about making mistakes and doing something better because of that mistake. It's about reflecting on what you can do to be a better person every single day. And, the journey continues. It does not stop for any of us. And we all have these ups and downs. And I think that the way to overcome adversity is to really make the most out of every opportunity and have your heart in the right place. And that is what we continue to do today.
Deep in your soul, there was that eggplant and pepper roasting thing, but perhaps it even gave you some power in a world where you were pretty powerless.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was the trick up my sleeve. It was a way that I could get a positive reaction out of somebody. And there aren't many, memories that I have as a child or a teenager where, I would get these positive responses because, I wasn't giving many people many reasons to respond positively to my actions. I was definitely rebelling and confused and angry, and food, every time that I was around food or that I would make something and hand it to somebody, that was always like a part of that highlight of my day. It was always the time that people were around me were happy, and that I've never forgotten that.
You never know with people these days which path they take, whether they go to the CIA or whether they find the right mentors that take
Hmm.
them somehow to a level like that. You got to go to the CIA.
Yeah, I did.
That must have been a challenge for a poor boy.
It was a challenge financially, but it was a saving grace for me personally. I didn't even know what the CIA was until, Donna and another teacher whose name was Seth Schramm, who taught my vocational class.
And of course, we're talking about Donna Barnett, who was your major high school influence, your home
Yeah,
ec teacher who kind of saved your life.
yeah, and she saw that I cared about food and that I had a passion for food, and she was able to steer me in the right direction. And when she said, "Well, what are you going to do after high school?" I didn't even have an answer for that. I didn't even know. I had no idea what I was going to do. And she said, "Well, I think you should go to culinary school." And I said, "Well, my family's way too poor. Like, we can't afford college." It wasn't even something I spoke with my parents about. Like, it never even came up that I was going to even go to college. My mother actually took a second mortgage on the house just to afford me transportation to get to and from school to the restaurant that I worked at. And Donna was able to really help with saying, well, there's actually, even if you are poor, there are ways that you can still go to college. And she said, well, let me do some legwork. And another teacher, Seth, also helped with that. And together they pulled together all of these scholarship applications and grant applications and helped me fill them all out. And we sent them all in. And I was able to get the majority of my culinary school education paid for just through scholarships and grants.
Mm.
And then I worked. I worked and saved money through culinary school, and I would pay the school as I would make money. And I took out a bunch of student loans, and we made it all happen. And when I went to culinary school, I felt like life started over, and I felt so excited about that. Being in the Hudson Valley the first night after my mom dropped me off, at that moment in my life was the happiest day of my life.
I bet. And I bet you were there with all sorts of resolve about changing your life even at that point.
Well, I was interested, in what I was doing. And I remember like making friends in culinary school that like cared about my feelings, that, asked me questions about who I was. And I remember walking down the hallways and the chef instructors like making eye contact with me and smiling at me. And I had not experienced that in high school. I had not experienced that before. I had really burned a lot of bridges, and given, my teachers were scared of me in high school. And so I had this opportunity to do something that I was interested in and that I was focused in. And all of a sudden I realized, hey, look, I could get straight A's. I can have perfect attendance. I can volunteer for different things that I feel are important. I would go and volunteer for the New York Restaurant Show, and the whole class would go down there and help with all the logistics of putting on like the CIA's display at the restaurant show, and those were all things that I felt very excited about and very happy about. And so once I got onto that path, I never looked back. I never looked back. And I didn't even like keep in touch with anybody from Philly. There was no like calling old friends and saying, "Hey, here's what I'm doing."
Yeah.
It was all about me starting from scratch, and I loved every minute of it.
You graduate from culinary school and you end up in Las Vegas. That's a wild trip.
Yeah. Well, I had a friend in culinary school who was from Vegas, and he offered me, you have to do an externship, and you have to leave school for a 9-month period between your first and second year to go and get experience out on the job, and that's part of the curriculum. So I couldn't afford an apartment. I couldn't afford to work for free. A lot of the people in my class were, going to New York City or going to San Francisco or going to, these major cities, and, their parents were paying for an apartment, or they were able to work for, $4 an hour or work for free. And I couldn't afford to do that. And I knew that I would have to go back home, and I would have to go back to that really small little IKEA bed that was in my room that I was already way too tall for. And I just there was nothing less that I wanted than to go back to where I just came from, because I felt like I had escaped. And so Kevin, my friend in culinary school, said, "Hey, why don't you come to Vegas and you can stay at my house with my parents and live for free. And the casinos pay $12 an hour." And I said, "Yes, definitely." And I went to Vegas and actually applied to go work at the MGM casino. And they sent a little packet to my dorm room, and I had to cut a piece of hair from my head and put it in there and send it back because they drug tested every single employee.
Uh-huh.
So I did that, and of course I failed the drug test, and I realized then that, oh my God, me smoking pot in my dorm room can literally ruin my chances for this career that I'm now so behind. So I was really, really freaked out by that. And so I, got all this crazy hair product and washed my hair with the soap that was supposed to get all the THC out of my system. And I took all these pills that, were supposed to cleanse my system out. And I never told anybody that I failed except for Kevin. And I went to Vegas. I interviewed at the Rio Casino, and they were like, "Okay, we'll hire you, but you got to take this drug test." And so I did it, and I passed. And at that point, I had already, I was already in Vegas living, ready to start my internship. And I knew that if I couldn't stay there, I was going back to my mom's house. And I didn't do any more drugs for after that period, because I knew that this was going to really kind of stop me in my path for my career.
After Las Vegas, you end up in St. Louis?
Yeah. So Harrah's Entertainment had purchased the Rio Casino where I was working, and there was an opportunity to move to St. Louis and open an Italian restaurant called Antonio's. And Antonio's was already, it was a restaurant at the Rio that was really well known and had been there for a while. So Harrah's was taking that brand and expanding it to some of their other properties. And I was a sous chef at Antonio's at the time there. And so they offered me a position as the head chef of Antonio's restaurant in St. Louis. And I said yes. I was 21 years old and had no idea what the hell I was doing. And they relocated me to St. Louis, and I opened this restaurant. And I felt like I had some kind of false confidence in cooking at that point. But of course, like my management style was needed a lot of work, and I learned a lot of lessons the hard way. But I made it through, and
Your gnocchi weren't so good right off
they
the
weren't
bat.
so good off the bat. They weren't so good off the bat, and that but those are I really have throughout my life have made mistakes and have taken those opportunities from those mistakes to do better. And that was one of those moments where, I was making a lot of mistakes, but I would always really work hard on trying to get better and better and better at it.
Was it the Harris connection that got you from St.
Yeah.
Louis to New Orleans?
Yeah. So eventually, New Orleans had always kind of been on my bucket list of places to come and cook. As a child, I would watch Paul Prudhomme and Emeril Lagasse on television, and Emeril was the first chef I ever saw do a cooking demonstration in Philly at the Book and the Cook Fair. One of the line cooks that I worked with in Philadelphia before I went to culinary school, I remember was leaving to come down to New Orleans and cook at Emeril's. And so I thought at that moment, this was before I even went to the CIA, I thought he was going to like Disneyland. I was like, oh my God, you're going to work for Emeril Lagasse in New Orleans. Like that sounded so exotic and it sounded so amazing. And like, it was like the pinnacle of an opportunity for a cook to be able to do that in my mind. And so I had an opportunity to come to New Orleans through Harrah's, and I came down, and I was at the age of 23, I was the opening chef of their buffet. And so when I came here to New Orleans, I all of a sudden was in charge of over 200 people that were employed in the buffet and working with the executive team at Harrah's. And the buffet had just gone over this $20 million renovation or something like that. And, and so then I, again, made a lot of mistakes and worked hard and tried to get better and kind of fumbled my way through it. And eventually I became the chef at the steakhouse at Harrah's.
Now, when you were the chef at the steakhouse in Harrah's, you still kind of had this Italian bug going on, didn't you?
I did. And I really felt like Italian food was my path forward for cooking. And I knew that I needed to identify with some kind of cuisine because my mind was kind of all over the place. And, for a while I wanted to do like a Pacific Rim type food, like in the late 90s. And I remember like when I was living in Vegas, like being really intrigued by all of the Asian cooking that was going on there. And I wanted to really nail down that identity for myself with what kind of food I was going to be cooking. So Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005 as I was the chef at the steakhouse. And that was a big moment for me to reflect and to say, okay, where is my next pathway going to be? And what direction am I going to take it?
We've been speaking with Chef Alon Shaya about his journey to become the celebrity chef he is today. Before 2005, Alon was a chef without a sense of direction. Following Katrina, everything began to change for him. After getting the steakhouse at Harrah's back up and running and meeting his future wife, Emily, Alon decided it was time to go to Italy.
Yeah. Katrina really affected me that way. And I knew that I had kind of faked it a lot up until that point when it came to me being a chef. I didn't quite know how to manage. I didn't quite know how to cook. I had been cooking my whole life, but, I was continuing to reach for things that I wasn't really comfortable with and I didn't really have an identity to. And so, I knew that there were like holes in the system. And I had this dream to open an Italian restaurant in New Orleans. And I knew that I needed to go to Italy and get experience so that I could come back and do that.
At the time, you were working at Besh Steakhouse
Yeah.
with John. Was he in on these conversations about you going to Italy?
So, yeah, I actually presented a business plan to John and Octavio saying this is my dream and this is what I'm going to do. And, we had decided that we could do it together and that to do that, I, was going to go spend this time in Italy, which really came out of the conversation that we were having about how to best open up an Italian restaurant together. And so it was just I think 4 or 5 months after Emily and I started dating, I said, "Hey, I'm moving to Italy," and she was extremely supportive and came out there a couple times to visit me, and it was another one of those life-changing experiences that I would never, I wouldn't be where I am without having that experience. So when I decided to go, there was no bank account to pull from. I funded the trip completely on my own, and I worked for free, and I also had room and board in Italy. So I didn't have to spend a lot of money.
Tell us about your first accommodations.
Yeah, well, I was in this restaurant outside of Bergamo, and I was set up on this apartment above the restaurant that I was working at, and a few of us shared this little apartment, and it was pretty much like a room with several cots, and when I was shown where I was going to sleep, it was right next to the dough mixer, and where all of the bread dough is made, and it was just a bare mattress, and I kind of was expecting there to be like pillows and sheets and a comforter, and there wasn't. So, the first week or so, I would fold up my T-shirts and use that as a pillow, and I would just kind of sleep with my clothes on, to stay warm. And one of my roommates eventually took me back to his parents' house and got me this old Spider-Man comforter that he had as a kid and an extra pillow, and brought it back. And then after about a week, I finally had a real bed to sleep on. I really had to find my own way through all of this. There was no roadmap. There was no, structure set to it. Mark Vetri and Jeff Michoud, who are two amazing chefs in Philadelphia and I've looked up to them for my entire career, set me up with the first connection out there. And I worked for people that they had been acquainted with. So that was really how it all started. And eventually I had found my path to a restaurant in Parma. And that's where I learned how to cure meats and make pizzas and continue my apprenticeship out there. But, this whole time I was really living off of my life savings. And I had, when I was working at Harrah's, I had a chance to save up some money. And I was working, when I was at the steakhouse, there was a time I worked 160 days straight before I even met Emily. When I met Emily,
she
was the one that convinced me to take a day off so we could go out on a date. And but I was, it was post Katrina. I was a workaholic. No one ever told me that I shouldn't work that much, and I was just working myself into the ground. And I worked, like I said, half a year, 6 months, a little bit more than 6 months, every single day, 12 to 14 hours a day. So I had saved up this money, and that was really what was able to allow me to go and realize my my dream in Italy of cooking with grandmothers. And then when I came back, it was several months later that we opened up Dominica.
Well, we in New Orleans certainly all benefited tremendously from that time that you've spent in Italy
Yeah,
because so many of the things between the cured meats, the house-made pastas, the pizzas, everything was just so incredibly new and fresh to us all somehow. And I think that has to be attributed to the authenticity that you were able to absorb while you were in
for
Italy.
sure. I mean, I wrote the menu for Dominica on the plane ride home from Italy.
Oh, how
And
exciting.
everything on the menu at Dominica was a reflection of my time out there. And that is why it was such a special place for me and why, I felt like we were able to make such a big impact on the Italian scene in New Orleans because I was cooking the foods that I cooked in Italy. I wasn't just kind of picking a Sicilian menu or picking a Northern Italian menu. This was all, everything was traced back to moments. The octopus carpaccio was traced back to a moment that Emily came to visit me, and we were on the beach and we went and had frito misto and octopus carpaccio, and the tagliatelle with rabbit ragu was exactly from this restaurant Alvedel that I worked at in Parma, and all of the salamis, and then Enzo, my pizza mentor, who I made pizzas with in Italy. That's where the pizza Enzo came from on the menu, and where the pizza dough recipe came from. And so all of these things at Dominica were truly these moments that I had while being in Italy that meant something to me.
I love the fact that you can take the boy out of Israel, but you can't seem to get Israel out of the
Right,
boy
right.
because I was there. I was dining at Dominica. I was watching as you went through this very interesting transformation
Yeah,
where your classic Italian menu started to have an Israeli bent without any of the real words attached to it. That
right.
was kind of a funny
Yeah,
trick.
it was. Yeah. Sprinkling za'atar on biscuits and making shakshuka in the wood burning pizza oven, with local chanterelle mushrooms and goat shoulders and roasted peppers and olives,
And
like,
calling it different names to make it
yeah,
sort of allowable.
right.
And then you really broke out and just started doing Passover. That was a pretty big jump.
Yeah, well, Passover, we were actually doing, I started doing Passover the first year Dominica was open. So Joe Nathan had come into town and had the Passover Seder and then wrote about it in the New York Times. And then the next year it got like quadrupled in size, and so many people came. And then it became such a special part of my identity there because I would get calls from parents and their students were at Tulane and they were saying, "It's our first Passover away from our children. Can we come and eat together at Dominica?" And it became something that was just greater than myself. And of course, like the whole Times Picayune staff would come and take a whole table in the dining room, and you would come
I'd
and
be with them a
and
lot of the
and
time.
yeah, and you would eat with them, and everybody kind of made it part of this tradition that I felt was very special. And so I felt like I could express my identity through the menu at Dominica, aside from my Italian culinary identity, which I still hold very true and strong to myself because I just love Italy and I love the food and those. Even though I can cook Israeli food, Italian food is half of my, or I should say, a portion of my heart. I also love Southern food and cooking Southern food a lot too.
Well, I'm so grateful that I was such a big fan of you and the restaurant from day one because I almost have this sensation that I was at Dominica right about the moment that you had a big revelation. I recall a moment when I sort of had my own Jewish grandmother, and I wanted to introduce you to Mildred Covert, and I
Yeah,
wanted Mildred to meet you.
yeah.
And it was on that day that you said, I've just come back recently from Israel, and the vegetables there are so extraordinary, and they're doing such simple things with them. I'm experimenting. There's a cauliflower.
Yeah.
I'd like you to try this
Yeah.
cauliflower.
Right.
And I believe that was the first time
I
I
think it
saw the
was.
now very famous roasted cauliflower.
Right.
Was that a transitional moment? Did the cauliflower somehow represent a special moment in time?
It did, absolutely. So I took a trip to Israel in 2011, and there was a restaurant in Israel called Abraxas North, and they serve these whole roasted cauliflowers, and they're famous for them. And I had that dish there, and I was transformed by it. It just, to me, was simplicity at its finest. I came back and figured out a way to kind of make it my own. And I, came up with my own recipe for how to marinate it and cook it and roast it. And we had this huge pizza oven. So I was like, I could fit a bunch of cauliflowers in there. So we started doing this cauliflower recipe and serving it with whipped goat feta cheese. And that was my version of labna. And it was with a cumin oil in the middle and a Aleppo pepper over the top of the cheese. And so here was labna and roasted cauliflower, and that was straight out of the Israel book for me. And everybody went crazy for it. And we ended up selling, 700 heads of cauliflower a week at Dominica. 100 portions a day. And it was, it showed me, the cauliflower dish showed me that I can express my Israeli heritage through my dishes and that people wouldn't turn around and run away and be scared of it.
I really love the idea that God was sending you a message through the cauliflower.
Yes, absolutely. It was a message saying, think about where you came from. And don't be afraid to express yourself that way.
When you decide that the next project's going to be Shaya, an Israeli restaurant, that was barely a thing in the United States. And all of a sudden, since the time of Shaya, it seems that there has been an incredible proliferation.
Yeah. Yeah, there has. It's pretty remarkable. And I think it's such a great thing that there's so much of an audience in this country for that cuisine, because it allows me to continue to, be proud of where I came from and cook that way.
And when we talk about the food of Shaya and the food that you became so well known for there, it really all goes back to your grandmother.
Yeah.
The story of the end of your grandmother's life is a particularly beautiful one.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us what you learned at the time that your grandmother was at the end of her life.
Yeah, she was really on her deathbed, and she had kind of summoned the whole family to come to Israel. And we all did. We all went there and spent a week with her. When I saw my grandmother and when we spent time together, food was always the topic, and it was all we talked about. And she couldn't really do much to get out of bed at that time. We were able to kind of take a stroll down the street and go to this Bulgarian restaurant with her, but it really made her very tired. And so really she was in her apartment the whole time. But I knew that this was going to be the last time that I ever saw her. I knew that I was going to get back on a plane and come to America, and that she was going to die before I would ever see her again. And she was very adamant that she pass along her recipes to me prior to her death. And so she would give me this list of ingredients to go buy, and I would go to the spice markets and go to the big vegetable and meat markets and pick all these things up and bring it back to the apartment. And I would, you know, walk back and forth from her bed to the kitchen and start cooking and taking direction from her. And I would document all of these recipes down. And I wrote them all down and all my notes and all this information. And I remember even wanting to impress her with a salad that I wanted to make for her with arugula and peaches or something like that. And so I bought those ingredients and I made that for her. And she says, "You're wasting your time. Like, don't cook that right now. Like, let's get through these recipes." And so we did that like day in and day out for several days. And I was able to leave Israel with my memories of her, written down in a book that, I've used to this day.
And of course, now you've written them down in your book
Yes.
for us all to share.
Yes.
This story has such a beautiful ending because, of course, your grandmother passes away. And of course, as we all know, you open up this very successful restaurant. And there's one dish that carries that thread through this story, from your grandmother to the restaurant to your mother's reaction to the whole thing. Tell us about that dish.
So that's the peppers and the eggplants that were cooking on the stove.
And the name of that dish?
It's called lutenitsa. It's a Bulgarian dish, and it was something that my grandmother made for us all the time. And when I opened that front door to my house at the age of 7 years old, it's that aroma of peppers and eggplants that made me fall in love with food.
So your mother comes to Shaya.
And so we open Shaya, and she walks in the front door. And the first thing I do is bring her a spoonful of this lutenitsa. And I say, "Mom, taste it and tell me if it tastes like Safta's lutenitsa." And she tasted it and she just started crying. And she was like, she would be so proud to see you here doing this and to honor her memory this way.
Well, I'm sure she is proud. And my goodness, I guess you've gone an extra step further now in making her proud, because one of your two restaurants is sort of named for her,
Yeah.
huh? Explain the names of the two new restaurants.
So Saba and Safta mean grandfather and grandmother, and they're the first two restaurants of our new company, Pomegranate Hospitality. And, they're going to serve as the grandparents for our hospitality group.
Why did you call this new venture Pomegranate Hospitality?
So pomegranate is a very symbolic fruit, and each pomegranate has 613 seeds. And each one of those seeds represents a mitzvah in the Jewish religion. And a mitzvah means doing something good for somebody. If I help you across the street, that's a mitzvah. If I, help you with your groceries, that's a mitzvah. If I save somebody's life from choking, that's a mitzvah. And I wanted our company to be full of these good things and full of all of these beautiful seeds that can blossom. And the pomegranate was really this great symbol for me to be able to do that. And as we've created Pomegranate Hospitality, we have spent all of our time focusing on the values that are going to make our company special, and that's going to protect our team members from any type of inequality or harassment or any kind of bullying. Like, we really want everybody to feel like they are working somewhere where they are comfortable and safe. And so we've set up these values, which include respect, communication, empowerment, accountability, passion, creativity, organization. And those will be the values that we will live by in this company. And we've built them into every process of that we're going to use throughout all of the restaurants. So if you want to apply to come work with us, you have to answer to empowerment. You have to answer to organization and communication. And when we sit down and do your evaluation, you then have to answer to those things again. And so we're building a team that will be focused on making sure that everything that we do ties back to these values and keeps us all fulfilling our promises to each other every day. I want to continue to be proud of who I am and where I've come from, and not build those barriers around my identity anymore. And I'm really excited to do that through the food at these 2 restaurants.
Well, I'm really excited to enjoy the food at both of your restaurants. I'll see you in Denver, too.
Thank you.
And congratulations about your beautiful new book and all of your wonderful success, Alon. You're making your grandmother proud, and me, too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alon. Come back and see us soon.
I will.
Alon Shaya, chef and author of Shaya, an Odyssey of Food, My Journey Back to Israel. Don't miss a delicious upcoming serving of Louisiana Eats by subscribing to our podcast. Also, visit poppytooker.com for lots more recipes and delicious food ideas. Music for this episode comes from Frames in Motion. Louisiana Eats original theme music by Johnny Sketch and the Dirty Notes. Thanks to Joe Schreiner and Reggie Morris, who produced this podcast. I'm Poppy Tooker. Thanks for listening, and thanks to our major sponsors, Camellia Bean, Zatarans, French Market Coffee, and Rouse's Markets. Visit poppytooker.com to see a full list of our partners. This Louisiana Eats Quick Bite was produced by Poppy Tooker Broadcasting.